This morning we scrambled to cover the RTX 3000 series official announcements from NVIDIA. They did not pre-brief the press for the most part for this one, so we got the news when you all did, and that video is already up if you're curious to learn more about it. We're also running an article, and we'll have that on the website if you want the written recap of it. For this one though, we're looking at the partner models of the RTX 3000 series cards that are announced thus far. These aren't reviews, obviously, but instead we're going to be looking at the cooling solutions, the changes versus previous generations, and everything that we know to date about some of the partner model cards. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Corsair Dark Core RGB Pro wireless mouse, which claims sub 1 millisecond wireless response, low latency Bluetooth, an 18,000 DPI sensor, a 2000 Hz polling rate, and interchangeable side grips. Corsair's mouse can charge on the MM1000 mousepad with Qi charging, or it can be used wired. Learn more at the link in the description below. So as stated, this isn't a review, which means you need to wait for our actual reviews, where we're going to do in-depth thermal testing on as many of the partner models as we can get a hold of for the RTX 3000 series. Typically, we do everything down to applying thermocouples all over the board and taking per component thermal measurements to see how the coolers are doing, and that will more than ever apply this generation because of the reference model from NVIDIA, which is very unique this time around. That said, it is worth looking at some of the designs early as we get prepped for what we're going to be testing soon and start filling in the details. We should also note that if some of these things start entering pre-order stages, stick around for the reviews if you can. You might miss the first round if you do that, so there's a downside, but generally speaking, with GPUs, given how expensive they are, it's typically worth getting some more information on them, because right now we don't even have detailed PCB shots. Actually, NVIDIA has expressly forbidden the board partners from giving us PCB shots this time after our coverage of the 2000 series when it launched, and we did teardowns, which were technically allowed, but NVIDIA wanted to disallow them, so they've learned. They've now explicitly disallowed certain things. Anyway, we're going to start with the EVGA in the stack because we have the most information from them. Very quickly, there is a Kingpin card already announced for the RTX 3090 series. The Kingpin cards are overclocking centric. They don't have to be overclocked. You can plug it in and just play games with it. But generally speaking, the KP cards, along with Galax Hall of Fame cards, MSI Lightning cards, things of that nature, they tend to be the best value when you're actually going to do a lot of serious overclocking with them. We've reviewed them before though, and the cooling solution stock with the cards like the KP ones do help hold a flatter frequency so you don't have as much boosting behavior, kicking the frequency down as soon as it heats up a little bit. But this one, it is equipped with 23 power phases. We don't know the split between memory and core right now. It will have a 360 radiator this time, so that's up from 240 previously. So the 360 CLC on there, it is going to have a Gen 6 Zotac pump from what we understand right now. There are not a ton of thermal performance differences between Gen 6 or even Gen 4 Zotac pumps or Gen 7. They're all roughly the same, but the primary changes are in the plastics and the housing and their resistance to things like decay from high water temperatures. The cold plate will still be protruding from the base to contact the GPU. It's a flat cold plate rather than a concave or a convex one. Those are typically reserved for CPU designs, so that helps with GPUs since you're already direct to silicon contact. We've reviewed those at least a dozen times over the years. There's an OLED screen, RGB, so it's like last time except RGB, and then it will have 3 8-pin power connectors. But that's going to be sort of a flagship for XOC territory, so not very common. Let's look at the FTW3. EVGA has made a major ID change to its coolers this generation. It's done that every generation, and we are curious this time to see how much the community hates the design EVGA has put together. Every time EVGA has changed its designs every single generation, it seems like the forum posts we see are who else hates EVGA's new faceplate. So this was the 1080 Ti series. I'm not holding a 30 series card. We don't have one. People hated this, but then later with the 20 series, everyone said, EVGA, go back to the 10 series. So anyway, they've changed it again, and this time the FTW3 has red accents on the left, right, and back of the card, somewhat resembling the old AMD reference GPU Batmobile cards. The fin stack uses the same cooling solution that was introduced with ICX. That includes, if you look closely, you'll see some piercings that run through the fin stack horizontally. This is supposed to help air escape the card. And then the back plate has holes punched through it as well. And our understanding is that EVGA is still intending to use thermal pads between the back plate and the PCB to leverage the surface area. The FTW3 is moving to ICX version 3. It will host the same 9 sensors that it did in the past. We don't have physical board photos, but we do have a render of their locations. These are NTC thermistors. They will be located on the GPU front side, GPU back side, memory left, top, and right, and then 4 on the VRM. These aren't particularly actionable for users, but they are valuable for enthusiasts or technicians, in our case, who can make use of the extra data without needing to wire up thermocouples manually. So we've talked about this in our reviews of FTW or ICX cards in the past. The sensors aren't a reason you should be buying the card for the most part. If you were doing something like what we do and you need a test vehicle to test other things, they become very valuable. But for the average enthusiast, it doesn't really provide you actionable information for the most part. The VRM temperature should be well under control. Memory should be well under control. And if they're not, then modulating the fan speed a bit isn't typically going to change things on a card like this. You're already at a point where if it's not good, it will almost never be good. So the sensors, the point is, don't get caught up on the sensors. It's cool. It's neat to look at like the temperature of memory modules and the VRM, but not being actionable. It's not something you should go out of your way to buy unless you have an idea for it, like maybe water cooling open loop, and you want to make sure that you've got absolutely perfect contact with everything, and you don't want any anxiety about whether it's contacting perfectly or not. That might be a good use case for it. The FTW3 will run 3 8-pin connectors and a yet undetailed VRM. It's running 7 heat pipes on the front side, 1 on the back side. The one on the back is to cool rear side memory modules. This is actually new information we picked up. So the 3090 will have 12 memory modules on the back. It's going to have 12 on the front. Then the 3080 and 3070 are only front side memory modules. So 3090s have a whole extra layer of testing that reviewers will need to do if testing the coolers properly, which is going to be to measure memory module performance on 2 sides of the card. Huge headache, but that's the job. And if you're a user, you just need to be aware of if the cards are designed properly. This is kind of new. It's not like they haven't done memory on the back before, but it's been a few generations. And so some companies that don't have maybe as much experience cooling memory modules on the back, like the newer ones or ones who've had engineers cycle through, there's potential for oversight there, is what we're saying. So we'll keep a careful eye on 3090s and their cooling solutions for the backside of memory especially. Now, this PCB has some holes cut through it, as stated, so it's like NVIDIA's where they're trying to push some air through, but it's not anywhere close to as much of a hole as was cut in the 3090, which is just like half the PCB's gone. It is using a heat pipe on the back as a straight, flat heat pipe, so you lose some of the performance characteristics of the larger round heat pipes, but also it fits better. So that allows you to get the back plate in there and then rely on thermal pads for transfer from the backside memory modules to the plate, or if it's 3080 or 3070, you don't have to worry about that at all. We also noticed an AMD-style retention bracket on the back side of the GPU for the FTW3. You'll see that in the renders, that we don't have photos yet. And that's to help distribute the load as you'd expect of the cold plate, as opposed to the typical 4 standalone screws. So depending on what kind of springs they're working with, also that could improve the cold plate contact with the GPU silicon. Speaking of the cold plate as well, much like the previous generations cards, EVGA is extending its cold plate to contact the memory. And as far as we understand right now, on all sides of the front of the board, doesn't apply to the back. And this means 2 things. One is your memory is obviously going to be cooler, but also it does mean that the GPU temperature will measure higher because it's sharing a direct cooling solution now. There's more power going into the cold plate than would be if it's just the GPU. We've demonstrated this in the past by testing with and without that type of cold plate and cooling the memory separately. Generally speaking, temperature goes up a little bit when you do that for the GPU, but the overall temperature of everything goes down. So typically worth it, but don't be surprised if it looks like the GPU is a couple degrees warmer than maybe a competitor if the memory modules are not measured between them. If they are, then we've normally seen that the memory is cooler as a result of this approach, but memory is also much less sensitive to temperature swings than the GPU core is, which is frequency dependent on is contingent upon temperature. So this is stuff we're going to run through all this in testing and tell you exactly whether or not the design was a good decision or not, obviously. EVGA has no pricing right now. None of these vendors do for the most part. A lot of them got the pricing either just before we did or when we did, which was publicly when you did. So they've been in the dark on this, and we won't get pricing until closer to launch, which is the 17th for everything except for the 3080. The 3090 is going to be the September 24th. And then the 3070 will be October sometime. Other quick news on EVGA stuff, they've got a hybrid card. We're not going to talk about that much today. The only difference we've noticed thus far that's important is a move to a 240mm radiator from the smaller radiators in the past. It will have an RGB fan on the radiator, or I guess two. Those will be controllable by GPU software, which is interesting because it means that there's an extra cable or a cable running down, well, it would be an extra cable, running down the tubes that has to plug into the GPU board, the PCB somewhere. So that's worth noting, I suppose. But the XC3 line is the one that EVGA expects will be its most popular and highest sales volume for this generation. It has the same ICX3 cooling solution, but it does not have the ICX3 other features. So those would be the sensors, the power module, which is part of the FTW3, but not the XC3, and that would also include, the fuse. So a couple things on this. Whether or not you care about these features will help you out. The fuses don't actually protect your card from an RMA. If you have a card, any of them, that has a fuse blow up, for the most part, the fuses are too slow to react to actually protect the component behind it, as we've learned from Buildzoid and videos we've worked with him on in the past. So typically what happens is it makes it easier to identify the issue, send it back in for repair, or if you're good at this stuff yourself, you can maybe replace it on your own. For the power module, that just tells you the board power. It's measuring out the cables, so you get a more accurate power consumption number reported in software for the entire card, because there's a physical hardware module on there telling you. It's not approximating anything. This should be more accurate than something like GPU-Z, which is reading from the GPU silicon, so you're missing out on VRM efficiency losses and things of that nature, other stuff on the board, basically. So those aren't super useful for a lot of people, but interesting extra features to consider. Let's move on to the next group of cards. We'll cover MSI next because they're taking this launch extremely seriously, the most seriously, actually. Their website is broken, so it's quick to get through this one efficiently. So MSI announced its Gaming Trio and Ventus cards for the RTX 3000 series. Unfortunately, we have limited information on these because the website has a few buttons on it, and when you click on any of the card links, it results in a 404 page that is somewhat grim and we're not sure is appropriate for YouTube. Scrolling down, though, and clicking on the Zero Frozer link bears some hope in the form of a video removed by uploader icon. But we'll work with what we have. So the list includes a 3090 Gaming X Trio, a 3090 Gaming Non-X Trio, 3080 variants of those, and the same for the 3070. MSI claims that its coolers will feature the Tri-Frozer 2 solution. And to help define that, it's pretty similar to the previous fans, except there's a bridge between every set of two blades. In theory, just from kind of looking at it and thinking about it, it seems like the purpose of this would be to direct the air straight down into the PCB a little bit more and have less airflow out the sides of the fan, off the edge of the blade and into the wall of the cooler, for example. So testing will reveal how that works, obviously. MSI historically has actually had pretty competitive card designs, not always. The RTX 2000 series, the 16 series, and the AMD 5000 series were lazy at best because the thermal pad solutions didn't really contact the memory modules properly or fully, and doing a few dollars of modding on MSI's cards like the Evoke series, which it later sort of fixed, it would often significantly improve performance. So MSI has a lot of ground to make back up from its 10 series, where with the 10 series, MSI really killed it with the 1080 Ti Gaming X, and the Armor was one of the absolute worst coolers ever shipped with a 1080 Ti, but it was a Gaming X PCB, which made the Armor awesome for water cooling and hybrid mods and things like that. So they've had some good ones, but it's been a while. MSI claims that it has, quote, totally cool core pipes. but it doesn't share any information on them. It appears as if the design will potentially be one larger heat pipe centrally with a flanking set of 3 smaller ones, but we don't think that image is to scale. The fin stack has some small hood scoops on it. This is supposed to help with acoustics and harmonics, but you start getting into small features just like EVGA's through hole, like pinholes in the heatsink, where it starts to get difficult to really verify how much that matters. But that's one of the features they were pointing out. MSI's thermal pad photo listed, render listed under the quote thermal padding section shows a full coverage pad on the memory modules. This is following up MSI's thermal pad issues on the AMD and NVIDIA cards, which it has acknowledged and attempted in some cases to improve. So they made similar claims back then. We'll have to actually open one to see if that's true this time, although almost certainly we will be buying these cards ourselves or asking for our viewers to loan them to us, because there's no way MSI is sending us anything right now. Thermal pad contact, though, is definitely something we need to look into and is suspect based on previous generations. The card claims, quote, ample amounts of thermal pads to allow various board components to transfer heat directly and so forth. So hopefully they've improved. That said, because the website is broken, we'll just move on to another broken website. Last time we reviewed a Zotac card, it was the company's RTX 2080 Ti Xtreme, if memory serves, and that cooler didn't even contact most of the components on the board. It was simultaneously one of the heaviest and largest coolers physically, and also one of the least effective for that generation. We also got blacklisted by Zotac for our 980 Ti review several years ago that demonstrated other issues with the cooler design, despite having several years of good coverage, of positive coverage about the things that Zotac actually did properly. Anyway, though, this is another one we'll have to buy or borrow to review. If you buy one of these, contact us via tips@gamersnexus.net. Let us know. We'll potentially borrow it from you and pay for the shipping both ways, send you a mouse mat or something like that. Anyway, fortunately for the length of this video and, well, Zotac, there's not much on this website either. It has several broken overview sections that load nothing and go to forbidden pages, so we're limited on information. Zotac announced technically 7 cards today, but only 3 of them have any details. The new lines are called Trinity, which is a 3-fan cooler and a huge cooler solution, and then Twin Edge, which is a much smaller dual-fan design. Zotac has historically been pretty good to the mini ITX or small system market by offering these smaller cards, and out of the 3 companies we've looked at so far, this is the smallest one out there. The Twin Edge still runs taller than standard slot height though, so this will limit its usefulness in mini ITX builds, even though it's at least shorter. The company's Xtreme line also returns in the form of the RTX 3090 Amp Xtreme and 3080 Amp Xtreme, hopefully this time with a cooler that actually contacts something, and it seems to make use of additional RGB. We're not sure if the greenish tint on the left side is plastic housing or some sort of digital RGB effect, but that's the distinguishing feature. Zotac's website, where it does work, says that the, quote, HoloBlack cards have an inspiring electroplated workmanship on a translucent flourish. So that's probably what it is. If anyone can tell us what that means, that'd be great, but that's probably what that thing is. Anyway, the word holographic here implies that maybe it's most likely a materials change, as you would typically see in foil or holographic anything, rather than an LED change. But there is value to having a unique looking design. We'll definitely credit them there. We do need to see a lot from Zotac though. The twin cards make the most sense for smaller builds thus far. Zotac is probably going to venture further into that space. Normally it does. Gigabyte is often one of the other companies that will make those smaller cards pretty early in the release cycle of a new GPU. And then finally, the backplate in the Trinity cards, that has an RGB LED strip that runs through it, and hopefully the backplate's a metal one, but it does have 2 small vents on either side flanking the GPU backside. Not a ton of ventilation, but something there at least. Zotac also claims a metal supporting underframe, which you'd typically refer to as a base plate on the top side or back plate on the rear side. And in early renders, the design looks like that's potentially more structural and less for a thermal solution, but it could certainly be used for both. It just depends on how Zotac decides to connect that plate to the card. A lot of the time you'll see these base plates acting as structural support, mostly to try to limit to the extent possible the flex of the PCB, also known as sag. And they'll often leverage that device that's there for structural reasons to sync the memory modules if it's not going straight into the GPU's shared cold plate as well. So we'll have to, if we get one, take it apart and see what that is. ASUS is next and appears to have some actual photos of cards, not just renders. The cards are in the dual Strix and Tough lines that ASUS has had previously. The Tough line has had a pretty tough time the last few years, mostly for poor execution of the cooler, but we're told that ASUS's engineers have taken the feedback seriously to improve upon for this generation. So we'll see in testing. The one thing that we did immediately notice was a dual BIOS switch on most of the cards in the photography. This has a performance mode and a quiet mode. That's typically what the companies do. Most realistically, this is useful for modding, or if you happen to find a power unlocked BIOS or relatively unlocked BIOS, you can try loading it on without much of a downside. As long as you only ever flash one BIOS, you can always flash the other one back if you happen to brick it with a bad BIOS or something. So it's nice to see. Certainly some of the other cards we've already talked about, like the high-end ones, will also have dual BIOS, but we just haven't seen the switches in many of the photos yet. The Strix runs a 3-fan design. It has similar fans to the past generations of Strix coolers. The fins for the fin stack are oriented top to bottom and aim exhaust towards the side panel and the motherboard. The card doesn't try to do too much fancy and stays closer to the roots of just being a large brick with a heatsink and a PCB. It's a 2-slot PCIe bracket, but the card itself is definitely larger than that, and that's based on the shroud protruding past the bracket. The top of the card has an RGB LED strip along it for the Strix, while the Tough model has a more simple LED for its Tough branding logo and some tire tracks on the back, presumably from when it got run over by reviewers like Upside Down Steve over at Hardware Unboxed in the previous review cycle.
And that takes care of that.
We noticed that the back plates and the PCBs on these cards also don't extend to meet the full shroud width, so this allows for some room for air to blow through the heatsink. Again, we're going to keep saying this, but that is not new. It's not unique. NVIDIA didn't invent it. We've reviewed plenty of cards in the past that have fins which extend past the PCB and fans that blow through them. Now, a lot of the time, the thing we've most often talked about is when the companies will still leave the back plate obstructing that air. So it's like you just throw away the whole reason you do that design. But it seems like NVIDIA's maybe had a hand in kind of telling the companies, hey, you should do this thing, because they're all talking about it this time. Anyway, the Dual from ASUS is its smallest card, and the photo allows an angle where we can see that it's at least 2.5 slots, if not more like 2.8. This should be one of the cheapest models from ASUS and one of the more traditionally sized ones, although it still exceeds standard PCIe slot height and so eliminates itself for more restrictive ITX cases. The Tough runs a 2x8 pin setup, Dual runs 2x8, and Strix has 3x8 pin connectors. As for Gigabyte, Gigabyte announced 4 cards at the time of filming based on 2 cooling solutions. Like its motherboards, Gigabyte is employing its Master and Xtreme brands for these 2 cards thus far, the coolers for them. The Gigabyte Master design is a triaxial cooler. It has 2 115mm fans towards the right side of the PCB, and then one 100mm fan that is on the left side. This isn't really that new for Gigabyte. They've done this in the past. Most recently, they've run one smaller fan centrally, and then the 2 larger ones at the outer edges. Gigabyte also runs these in opposite directions, also not new for the company. This is just Gigabyte's unique spin on how it tries to market its cooler. So the arrangement has the smaller one on the left this time that also has it probably over half of the VRM, and maybe that makes more sense for this particular generation. Like some of the other partners, Gigabyte also has a hole through its backplate to allow for air to exhaust towards the CPU tower cooler. But once again, this isn't all that different from previous designs. It's just getting called out more explicitly this time. The Master looks like it's making use of digital RGB LEDs on the backplate, judging by the renders, and it has an OLED readout with the GPU temperature displayed in its early renders. We'd assume that this can be changed for other information, but we don't have full documentation yet. Now, interestingly, Gigabyte, with its website that actually works, has additional information on the cooler design. So they're going with a vapor chamber for direct contact to the GPU. This will be primarily interesting for doing pressure testing, because vapor chambers have columns of copper within them for structural support and cooling. And that, depending on how it's executed, can be potentially misaligned with where the GPU is, as we've seen with some of the AMD cards in the past. But typically, they most often get it right, since it's kind of a basic thing. That'll be something we'll be looking at, though. So vapor chamber for that, for direct contact to the GPU. The render makes it appear as if maybe a base plate's used for memory, but we'll have to take it apart. The vapor chamber feeds into the heat pipes, and then the more traditional fin stack. So everything's pretty standard here, and we can see an aluminum fin stack on either side as well. That's explicitly where the VRM would be located. The Xtreme, on the other hand, is massive. Easily one of the fattest video cards we've ever seen. It looks like something you'd find at the scene of like a bludgeoning. It's not a light card. This thing is thick enough that it should hopefully be able to run passively under some moderate amount of load. Like, not full load, but if they can do 60, 80 watts passively, that wouldn't be all that surprising and would be a potential upside, but it's gigantic, at least from the renders. So it's the fattest heatsink we've seen thus far today. This is equipped with only 2x8 pins for the power. That's plenty in almost all circumstances, but just sort of interesting that of all the things to all the marketing arrows to shoot at this particular box, the 3x8 didn't make it. So 2 8 pins, that's fine. Fat cooler, short PCB allowing air to flow through to the rear of the card, and it's also got an OLED on it. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. That'll recap you on most of the basics for the cards and the coolers. This is a really heavy push from the partners this time. It's been a couple years since NVIDIA's put out a card, about 2 years now, and the last round, the 2000 round, really was sort of its first foray into this particular approach to its GPU design. So it seems like there was a lack of interest last time, then a lot of interest this time. So we wanted to round them up. You can expect us to be reviewing a lot of these and should subscribe to catch that. Of course, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to prepare for upcoming PC builds and buy one of our GN wireframe mouse mats, which is a desk-sized mouse mat. Highly popular. We have had trouble keeping them in stock, but we've actually got enough. Finally, we got a little bit ahead, so you've got some time if you want to pick one of those up. Otherwise, the medium mod mats are also in stock. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.